Hello, everyone, and welcome to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. Joining me today is a first timer here on the channel. My guest today is a mom of two little ones and is used to daily chaos. From a young age, she escaped in the pages of fantasy novels. She loves writing stories, dreaming up magical worlds, and learning about mythology. When she isn't found typing up her new ideas, most likely ignoring her husband to write, she is in the garden with her daughter or enjoying a book with her son. An engineer by day, she uses her writing to uplift powerful women, whether behind a computer monitor in an office or a shield on the battlefield. And to tell us all about her book and more, let's give a huge round of applause to Dyson L. Houpt, otherwise known as DL Houpt in the Bookstagram world. DL, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. Now, before we dive into your book, is there anything else you would like to mention about your background?
No, I think you covered it. I apologize in advance for my mom brain that'll probably happen in this interview. Not a lot of sleep in my house lately, so take that as you will.
No worries, no worries. So, the book that we're actually talking about is one actually caught my interest because of the title, The Shadow of Polaris, which I understand you've been reworking on as of recently. So, for those who aren't aware of your book, can you tell us about The Shadows of Polaris?
Sure, yeah. So it's a fantasy romance novel that is very loosely based on the Cupid and Psyche myth.
Ooh.
It follows a lot of various themes from mythology. I like to refer to it as like epic fantasy for dummies. It has that feel with a lot of like epic battles and sword fighting and things along those lines, but without maybe the really heavy world building that you would
Okay.
get in like Game of Thrones or um, Crescent City fans, things like that. So yeah. Um, yeah, I don't know how much you want me to dive into it, but that's kind of like a very brief overview.
Nice. So, Dio, tell us about like what sort of sparked this passion to create this story. I know you've been very interested, based on your brawl, into storytelling for a very, very long time. So, what would you say was the initial spark that came about in your life that made you think, I want to tackle this. I want to create my own story and share it with people.
Yeah, well, let's see. So, like you mentioned, I have been writing stories for as long as I can remember. My mom's an English teacher, so there was no way I was not going to be a reader or a writer. um, but I think I took a step back in college when I went more of the STEM route. My creativity was kind of put on the back burner there. Um, but it really wasn't until after I graduated during the pandemic when book talk really blew up. And I think
Right.
you'll find with like a lot of newer authors that they kind of had this moment where they returned to reading a little bit because of book talk. Um, and so I think for me, I was in the similar boat and I read, ACOTAR, From Blood and Ash, like all the book talk books. And I kind of finished one day and I thought, like, I could write something like this, So that was kind of the day and the turning point where I said, I'm going to sit down and actually give this a try. And if it goes nowhere, it goes nowhere. And here we are, God, almost 4 years later. um, and yeah, I have a written book. So that's that was kind of the aha moment, if you will.
Nice.
Yeah.
So, when you began writing The Shadows of Polaris, what was your goal that you set out with as well as the need you want to satisfy for your future readers. Would you say that your book delves heavily into the romance fantasy, like, there's a lot of romance, or would you say that there is romance in it, but it wouldn't be classified as romancy?
Right. Well, so this book, it's book one in a series, a trilogy that I'm working on. And I think the romance is definitely a big piece in the first book, but as the trilogy goes on, I think the biggest theme is really like motherhood and mother figures. I started writing Shadow when, well, actually, I started it before I got pregnant with my daughter, but I really finished it and dove in during my pregnancy with her. And so I kind of wanted to write something that was really like, it explored those themes of motherhood in a way
Right.
that's kind of unique and not like in your face about it. So the themes are very subtle. The mother figures in the book are all play very different, very important roles. And you'll see that more in books 2 and 3, I think. But yeah, so long-winded answer. There is romance in there because, there's an FMC and an MMC, and their story is really the first book, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily the biggest theme or what my goal was in portraying when I set out to plot the trilogy.
All right. Now, when you neared the final stages of the Shadows of Polaris, what was the initial feedback like from friends and family, as well as reviewers, when you first published it before now relaunching it again? Was it positive, mixed? And is there one review that really has stood out to you looking back at Shadows of Polaris?
Well, before I got any reviews, I went into this whole the indie pub process, not knowing anything. I just
Mm.
kind of like threw my book out there and said, "Here it is." I made an author Instagram the day I published. So I didn't really do like any of the like launch stuff that goes along with that, like beta readers, arcs, literally any of it. I didn't do. I had a couple friends and family read it, and they said, "This is really good. I really enjoy how descriptive your writing is," or "I really love this character," or "Oh my God, how could you?" Couple scenes. So apologies in advance to future readers. But I think one review I got that really stood out to me was my first ever review, and it was not posted. It was a bookstagrammer who,
Mm.
out of the kindness of her heart, took some really great notes, developmental notes for me, and she gave me a lot of really great feedback and said like it probably needed a couple beta readers, things like that. Um, and I go back to her notes like all the time as I'm writing book two, because I think she pointed out a couple little plot tidbits that I wanted to dive into a little bit more, where in your head you know what's going on, but
Right.
you necessarily don't know that, like the reader doesn't necessarily know. So I think sometimes little small details of the plot or little plot holes can be overlooked. So I'm definitely using that as I'm moving forward. When I started getting reviews like on Goodreads and things, they all were very positive. Some of them, had feedback like this could have used some beta readers, like maybe a little bit more, like the pacing is off a little bit here and there. Um, which makes sense, like this was the first time I've really tried writing
Right.
in this sort of way. So I took all of that and I'm using that, like, it was great. I mean, it was like, ouch, but I think in the end it'll make my writing for book 2 better. But other than that, people have really enjoyed reading it, and I think the story is heartbreaking and unique to the genre a little bit. So I think, I don't know, I think people, it's positive overall for sure. I am very nervous to hear what all the arcs for this relaunch have to say. So,
All right, all right.
yeah.
So, from the initial reaction of friends and family and reviewers, do you feel that their response validated your goals when starting this journey with Shadows of Polaris?
Yeah, I think so. I think so far, at least. I think that question will be better answered once the trilogy is complete and people read books 2 and 3. Because there,
Right.
as there is in every first book, things are always left.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think it'll be more so once the trilogy is complete.
Nice. And now we actually turn to our first reflective question, DL. So brace yourself for this one. This will be one of a few, and some
Okay.
of them will be a little bit more uh reflective than the last. All right.
Okay.
So as I'm sure you definitely know, like with all the other authors that I'm sure you've probably met on Book Talk, Bookstagram, and other places. Being an author, it's not an easy a business. It's not a quick money scheme as people would like for it to imagine. It's hard work, dedication. It's like hours and hours of editing and revising. And then once that's done, you got to find a cover artist. You got to find an editor, which is finance and balancing and all that stuff. And then once you have all that, then you have to make a decision. Am I going self-publishing or am I going traditional publishing? And whichever route you decide to go on, you then put your book out there for the world to see. And then that's when the true anxiety comes in, that voice of imposter syndrome speaking in the back of every author's head saying, what are you doing? You shouldn't be doing this. Are you crazy? You are not going to be the author that you think you are. So for you, MDL, in your own experience, have you ever had moments of imposter syndrome? And if not, what has continued to discipline you to not only write and bring about the Shadows of Polaris, but also relaunch it again with a clear perspective, as well as staying true to the goal of making this a series?
So I have spouts of imposter syndrome probably every day. um, yeah, especially I think it was hard for me because I did go into the whole indie pub world blind, like totally blind. And I really had no idea what I was doing, and I really didn't do like my homework that I should have done. So it's very easy for me to kind of get down on myself and like really get down in the dumps about like, oh, if I had just done this, or oh, if I had just like, looked at other indie authors in the genre, or oh, if I had just found some beta readers. Um, so I think one of the big things that I always try to remind myself is something that a author who is far more successful than me and probably far more successful than I'll ever be had once said. She offered some really really great advice. It was keep your eyes on your own paper.
Yes.
So really like what you see from your peers and fellow authors who are maybe at the same level or not, like, maybe slightly above you,
Mm-hmm.
is that that's like their polished final presentation. What you don't see is all the edits, all the struggle, all the like, the mental toll that it takes on all
Right.
of us. Um, and a lot of times you see authors who this is not their debut that gets popular. They've written, like 5, 6 books beforehand. Like they have experience under their belt. And so what you're seeing when you see them get all of these readers and people who like rave about their books really is from a lot of, you know, background work. that you don't see. So I think I always have to remind myself that. Like, and I really have to remind myself, don't compare your book or your words to anyone else because it's very unique to me. Um, so yeah, that's something I struggle with every day. And like, I don't know if it'll ever get easier, to be honest.
Nice. All right. We actually touched on something that we actually will talk about later in the interview, which is, the sort of like the glitz and glamour of like one a first time author would imagine when they create their debut novel, which actually is a perfect now segue into the business side of being an author. Now, Adil, as you said in the beginning, that you published Shadow of Polaris initially like blind. You did not know very much of the self-publishing world at the time. Now relaunching the book, do you have a better perspective of the self-publishing world? And also, looking back now at everything, would you have wanted to go the traditional publishing route, or do you feel that Shell Polaris is a story that already should have been in the self-publishing lane from the get-go?
That's a good question. Yeah, with this relaunch, I definitely feel like I have a little bit more under my belt. And I also have a couple author friends on social media that I've made that have been like very helpful who have done this before. So I think with the relaunch, I'm definitely a little bit more geared up to actually releasing the book. Um, I would have loved to gone the traditional publishing route, but this is not my day job. So I think for right now and for, what I have time for in my life, and what stage I'm at with my day job career, I think the indie route was definitely the way to go. And I also, am starting to realize that I really like the freedom and flexibility of being able to control what it goes out there a little bit
Mm-hmm.
more. And being able to say, hey, I want to relaunch this and just like doing it, if that makes sense,
Definitely.
me.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
you and I are actually very, very in the same boat. Like I actually relaunched two of my books like the past week. I did more of like a silent relaunch. I told people saying, hey, here are the second editions of the stories now. They're up there for you to read. They're a little bit more revised, updated, so forth. But yeah, it is actually very, very interesting because you're right. The self-publishing route, you do have a little bit more creative control over your work. But in the other side of the coin, it's also okay, everything's out of pocket. It's like, the editors, the cover artists, marketing, and all that stuff. Which I definitely think marketing is probably like the one thing a lot of in the authors, especially myself, struggle because it has to be consistent. You have to keep telling people, hey, a few more days until the book releases. Hey, 5 more days until ARC applications are open, or so what, and everything else. So it's a lot of planning that goes behind everything. And also, speaking of business, thing that also is really interesting to discuss is the audience. Now, I brought this up numerous times on the show, viewers and listeners, but it is important. When we write books for ourselves, I'm sure you, DL, will also have a comment on this, is that we initially write our books for ourselves because we love these stories. We know them better than anyone else. But when we want to publish them and share them with others, we really have to consider, okay, well, who's the audience that I'm writing for? Is this the sci-fi audience, the fantasy audience, the romance fantasy, the thrillers, whatever? And that really had to take into account, okay, who's actually going to read this? So, Neil, in your opinion and from your experience, how important is it for an author to really understand who their audience is? And do you have a good idea of who your audience is for the Shadows of Polaris?
yeah, I think it's really critical because you can have a brilliantly written contemporary romance, you know, but if I read it, I'm going to hate it because I'm not a contemporary fan at all. So it's so important to figure out who your target audience is. With Shadow, I am slowly trying to pinpoint like the very niche audience within the romantasy genre. There, some people like spice in their novels, some people don't.
Yes.
Some people like, heavy world building, some people don't. So it's been a journey trying to find that pocket of people and that enjoy the various things. And I think a really great way of doing that has been putting out what tropes I use, really being descriptive in my marketing about things like world building, defining whether or not there is spice, things like that.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's absolutely critical finding your target readers because those are the people that are going to love your book and they're going to be the ones that are your champion in the end. They are going to go out and tell all their friends how much they loved your book. And I think as indie authors, the best marketing we really have is word of mouth from our readers.
Yes.
So, yeah, I think that's absolutely key in this whole thing.
Nice. And it is very, very true. Another thing also to consider is also, the authors who inspire all of us. And I actually remember this actually past week I had Eric Bowden on the show, and she brought up a really good point, which ties into this question is for all authors, we're always inspired by, books that we've enjoyed growing up. But when it comes to writing our own stories, we don't want to imitate or replicate the stories or the storytelling of the authors that we've enjoyed. When people pick up our books, he said, we want them to understand, hey, this is an Eric Bolden book, and I want them to understand this is what they'll expect when they read an Eric Bolden book, which is something that I really never considered, which is true. When you pick up a Stephen King book, what do you always expect? There's going to be some elements of horror. There's going to be some elements of fear. I mean, look at it, the clown. When we read the book, I've never read the book personally, but for people who have read the book, they know what to expect from Stephen King. Same with J.K. Rowling or George R. R. Martin. We know what to expect from them because we've been reading stories from them for a long time. So for you, DL, what authors and stories would you say have really helped you craft your author presence and authorial voice for your story in terms of character arcs, story structure, world building, and other elements in the Shadow of Polaris?
Oh gosh. I feel like there are so many. I feel like every book that I've loved, to read even as a child has really kind of shaped who I am as a writer. I think some of the big themes and these are probably very common answers with authors in the romantasy genre, but some of the big things that I think really sculpted my writing was how descriptive SJM is with ACOTAR. I really loved like feeling like I was transported into her books. So I knew going in, I wanted my readers to have that same feeling. I also, I mentioned From Blood and Ash. That was a series that I didn't like, oh my God, I love this book, but there were pieces of it that I really enjoyed. Like I loved the fighting scenes and how Jennifer Armentrout describes the fighting scenes and the action. So I knew I wanted to kind of embody that in a way. And yeah, let me think. I think those were the two big ones. But I do want to kind of follow up on that and say that Shadow is very much a reflection of myself as a person and my experiences in the world. So there's very heavy like astronomy in there.
Okay.
I have always loved like the constellations and all the myths behind them, things like that. When I was in high school, I did a semester at sea trip. And I remember my favorite part one, I really liked learning about all the celestial navigation and using sextants. I thought that was really cool. But my favorite memory was bringing up a constellation book that I have and sitting on deck at night and being able to like find the stars and like read about the constellations or like share those stories with other people that were with me. So I think a lot of the themes that you'll find maybe aren't necessarily like the writing and the language that maybe not the language, but the writing and like, the description that I use, I think has been sculpted by other authors for sure, but the themes are very much sculpted by my own life.
All right.
Yeah.
Nice. And I think you may have answered this, but we could go more in detail. And this question actually now talks about readers. And the reason I bring this up is that readers, I will say, are different from the audience. Some will say, well, what's the difference? There is actually a clear difference because you can write for an audience, like a broad audience, but the readers, who are you actually targeting within the audience? It could be, okay, case in point, let's say the romance fantasy, which is the most read genre in the fantasy world, as well as the publishing world. It's read, I think, 6 times in a month more so than other genres of books. Yeah,
I
I
know
found
that.
that out too from a fellow author. And the reason I bring this up is even in the romance fantasy, you have, as you've mentioned earlier, the different subgenres. You have the more spicy romance fantasy stories. You have the more young adult romance fantasy. You have the more adult fiction romance fantasy, and all these other subgenres. And they have their own specific readers. And going back to my friend Eric Bowden, whose story was more of like a bridge between Percy Jackson and George R. R. Martin. He wanted to be that bridge where it's not really young adult, but it's not really full-on adult fiction. Sort of like that good middle ground that both groups could read and enjoy. So for you, DL, do you have a good understanding and idea of your readership for the Shadows of Polaris?
So I think about 95 to 100% of my readers are women, first of all. And of that, I would say probably like 80% are most likely moms. Or, when I wrote this, I really said, would I enjoy this if I was a reader? And I
Right.
kind of then went on to market to readers that I thought were very similar to me. So for example, when it comes to spice, there's some intimacy, but grandma's not going to be clutching her pearls when she reads my book.
All right.
So yeah, I would give it, a lower on the rating of the 1 through 5. I'd say it's like a 1.5.
Right.
But on the like violence side of things, maybe like a 5. Maybe a 4. Probably I'm kind of rating that off of like Game of Thrones. I don't think I'm at Game of Thrones level with the violence.
All right.
But I would say like a 4, So it's hard for me to categorize as like YA, NA, spicy, things like that, because it kind of is very like fluid all over the place. And, it is a very subjective thing. Like readers will say you have different levels of things that they can handle or that they enjoy in books. So,
Right.
I think I got off track with your question. Sorry.
Oh no, I think you were nailing it right there.
Okay.
Talking about how your readership is mostly women, and within that group, 80% are mothers. But for your story, Shadows of Polaris, it doesn't really have like a set readership, because while the spice is definitely at the 1 scale and like 1 through 5, the violence, as you said, it's not George R. R. Martin where it's like very, very grotesque and graphic,
Yeah.
but it's also not PG-13. If I had to get like a movie rating, it's almost like an R rating where it's
Yeah.
just that right balance where it's up in your face, but you're not going to get sick while reading it.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that. As far as the readership, I think my goal is for my readers to kind of feel like they're reading a book that really empowers the female characters.
Mm,
So, you know, in my bio, I talk about how my writing is very much to empower women who maybe don't feel like they have a voice, behind a keyboard in an office cube, or, like I said, carrying a sword and, a shield on the battlefield. So I think my readership are probably primarily the women who maybe feel like they need a little extra of a voice in their lives, you know, um,
right.
at the end of the day. And people who enjoy fantasy, obviously.
Nice.
But
That actually very much reminds me of another author who I had during my June lineup of M. Fire, who is also a parent. And when she was writing her story, she was actually dared to by her daughter to write a story. And it's like, okay, well, I'll do this if you actually finish your story. So her daughter dared her to finish her own story. And when she was creating this story, she wanted to tie it to her heritage because she grew up in a town in Texas that's a mix of, U.S. Culture, Mexican culture, as well as indigenous folklore and oral tradition. So she wanted to blend all of that together, but she also wanted to, in a way, give agency back to women, in a sense, women around her age, where people think, oh, she's at this point in her life, what else can she do? She wanted to give agency back to women, as well as in her story, who's also a parent, to also have her voice. So I think it is very, very fascinating, and with that goal in mind. And that actually leads into another important discussion, which I think you brought up very early on, DL, which is pretty much, the legacy. You're talking about, for us, whenever we see these great books by these titans of the publishing world, we only see the finished product. We don't really see the journey along the way. And I definitely feel for first time authors, um we get lost in the glitz and glamour of what it is to be an author, and that comes down to the two questions: is do you want to be an author, or do you want to be known as an author? Because those are two very different things. To be an author is where you are solely dedicated to the craft of storytelling. You want to create worlds that get new people to enjoy reading or start reading again. Money's not the sole driving force. It's nice to get capital from it, but it's not the driving force for you. Now, to be known as an author is the opposite, where you are solely dedicated to building your brand as an author, stretching out and targeting everything from the marketing aspect, going on podcasts, doing interviews, uh, tabling, whatever, because you want people to know who you are as an author. But that definitely leads to a very important thing that needs to be considered if people go down that route, which is for first time authors, or for any author in general, there is no guarantee that your debut novel is going to be the start of your legacy. Now, there are exceptions to that rule. There are authors who have been able to publish their debut story and reach award winning status from that story and live off of the success to write new stories and tales. But on the other side of the coin, you have authors who fall, rise again, and fall down even hard. And then that voice of imposter syndrome comes back with a vengeance because you didn't target your audience, or your goals that you set out weren't realistic. So, Dio, in your opinion, How important is it for authors, be they new or returning, to really understand that their debut novel does not guarantee the start of their legacy, but it should not deter them from creating stories if being a storyteller and author is truly what they want to be?
Yeah, I think it's probably very, I mean, it is very important. For me, I think there was a little bit of that like shock when I was like, oh, I'm not a bestseller. Oh, you mean I just threw my book on Kindle and I'm not, SJM status? No, I'm kidding. But I think it is really important because, like I had mentioned, a lot of these bigger authors, especially in the indie world, have published multiple times before they've, their book sells, before they have that book that people love. And it's you don't really see that if you are just, scrolling through social media and you see a reel with an author that says, "Oh, I have like 1 million pages read on Kindle Unlimited right now," or things like that. Most of the time, they already have like they're mid-level in their career. They're not just
Right.
starting out. So I think it's really important. Back to you, kind of mentioning whether you want to be an author or known as an author. I think um, kind of having like a middle ground there is important, at least for me, because with my stories and my writing, I have a very clear goal in mind, and I have a very clear voice in what I want my readers to feel or to imagine things like that
Mhm.
when they're reading. Um, and my stories have a message that I think is really important in this world, and that's empowering women and exploring motherhood and in ways and mother figures, I should say, in ways that maybe haven't been explored before or aren't really discussed in our genre as much. Um, but I think it's also really important to be able to market yourself and to be able to go on to podcasts. I was really nervous about going on your show. And talk about yourself as a person and your work and things like that. And you know, there is good marketing, and there is good ways of building a brand. Those are going to draw, that's what draws people in, but then your story and your authorship is what keeps people. So I
Yes.
think it's important to have a balance for sure.
Definitely, definitely, and I know the feeling. I actually, in my journey as an author, I probably have only ever been on, I want to say maybe 3 podcasts in my, I want to say 4 years of writing. I was interviewed by old friends of mine. I don't know if they still go by this title, but Mystic Mode. I was interviewed on her podcast. Lady Rowan. I was interviewed on her podcast, and recently I was interviewed on my good friend Luke's podcast as well for my second novel, Amulet Son of Persia, because it is a very interesting feeling to, as you said, talk about yourself, your journey as an author. It's nice exposure, but it is kind of that little nervous factor into that little anxiety too, because you're telling people about something that you're passionate about for a very, very long time, something that has taken years to create. But then I also think it's also good to remember the people who have been by, our side from the very beginning, be it friends, family, or people we've met in the indie author community, which I will say the indie author community on Instagram is just so positive,
Oh
so
yeah.
nice, so caring. I've learned so much from a lot of people, and most of my guests are from the indie author community on Instagram, which is incredible. So for you, DL, looking back, who would you say have been the biggest supporters of your journey, from starting off on a computer screen, typing up the first words of the Shadows of Polaris, to now relaunching it for this fall?
Let's see. These are going to be like the cliche answers, but they're just so true. My mom, she has always been a huge support in my writing. Anytime I had like an issue with my plot, I would send her text, be like, "Hey, I'm struggling here," and she would offer me some wisdom or some words of encouragement. Um, my husband, for sure, he just puts up with me ignoring him while I type on my computer. That is like not not that wasn't like a joke in my bio.
No, but I know what you mean.
And then I feel like in the beginning, when you don't really know a lot of indie authors, or peers in your community, especially for me, because my day to day, that my work community, my professional community is vastly different than the romantasy world. I mean, I'm an engineer so by day. So you can probably imagine like the other engineers aren't reading ACOTAR or any of the indie author books.
Right, or The Fourth Wing. Sorry, I had to mention that book because a lot
Yeah.
of people keep mentioning The Fourth Wing on the show.
I don't know if any of my peers, my colleagues have read Fourth Wing.
No, I imagine not.
But yeah, so I think it was really hard in the beginning, and this is a very long-winded answer, but I had to kind of be my own support in the very beginning, and I had to find ways and reasons to keep going, especially like you had mentioned when that imposter syndrome is like really crippling.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, and I talk about this all the time on my social media, and I'm sure people are like, yeah, we get it, you're a mom, like, shut up. But being able to be a role model for both of my kids, especially my daughter. I mean, obviously I love my son too, but especially my daughter, being able to show her that I'm putting in the work and like, even if there's a really low point where I'm feeling super discouraged, that I pick myself back up and I keep going. That is like the most important thing to me. And I think most parents, whether you're a mother or a father or parental figure or guardian, whatever, um, they can relate to that.
Right.
So a lot of times my biggest support has been myself, or, thinking about in the future when my daughter's older, pursuing her career aspirations or goals in life, looking for guidance and seeing that I did the same thing, or I kept going when things were hard. So yeah, that was kind of a long-winded answer, but and an emotional answer, but that's my truth. So
Yeah, that's actually, very, very true. And actually very similar to what Anne Fire said in her answer on her interview, which is very much going to be a role model for, her daughter, which I think is very, very true. And especially like in like the writing world, people think that, it's easy to craft a story. It's not easy, people, because as one author said on my show, grit trumps talent. Doesn't matter if you're the best storyteller. Doesn't matter if you can make something jump off the page. If you're not willing to go through the hurdles, the fires, and the flames, little Dragon Force reference for those who grew up listening to their music, then you may want to reevaluate your goals that you set out with on this journey. And if you do reevaluate yourself, let me tell you this, you will get better because grit transforms into talent. And we only get better as time goes on. Going back to what DL said earlier in the interview, when we look at the authors that we've all grown up reading, they didn't start off as bestsellers. They had to go through hurdles to get their stories out to people, find the right publishers. Because that's the thing I forgot to mention, viewers and listeners, the self-publishing world has really boomed in the last 20 years or even like a decade or so, because going back in the past, many people at the time viewed self-publishing as a lesser form of publishing. It wasn't professional. There was no crispness when we see a book. Like when you think of the publishing titans, you think of Macmillan Publishing, Penguin Random House, Tor Books, Del Rey. I mean, those companies have gumption. But now, in the publishing world today, you can't tell if a book is self-published or not because it's gotten that much better. And that just comes from trial and error for all the authors in the self-publishing world, where we've all learned a lot from our peers. We've grew with these people. We've learned from our fellow writers, and we've taken it to heart and applied it to our own writing, which leads to the final question, DL, the last reflective question. So, with everything that you have learned and still learning about the self-publishing world and your journey as an author up to this point in your life, what is your word of wisdom to future authors or current authors watching this episode right now who are just starting off in their journey? What is your word of wisdom to them?
I'm sure like every person that you interview, if you ask that question, says the same thing. But first, definitely just keep going, keep writing. I'm in the trenches with my first draft right now for Shadows sequel. And I have to remind myself the first draft is like what we throw in the trash.
Right.
Fire.
Mm-hmm.
So just keep writing. At the end of the day, it's really easy to get caught up in feeling like I'm a failure because I don't have thousands and thousands of viewers on my Instagram page, and I only have this many followers, and this author has, so many more than me. But at the end of the day, it's about writing. We're writing stories, we're sharing our voice with people, and I, for one, have had to kind of check myself a few times, being like, I'm getting way too sucked into the social media and the marketing aspect. So take a step back, focus on writing, and keep going. Find, what drives you. For me, that's my children.
Mm-hmm.
Others, it might be, something else, but find something that keeps you going and cling on to that. Really cling on to it as hard as you can, to keep going and to keep pushing. So yeah, I think that's what I would say.
Awesome. And that's a perfect way to end this amazing author interview. Thank you, viewers, so much for joining us for another author interview here on the channel. A huge thank you to Dyson, otherwise known as DL Houpt, for coming on the show and telling us all about her journey as an author and what to expect with the Shadows of Polaris coming soon. DL, thank you so very much for coming on the show. Where can people find and engage with you on social media? And do you have any announcements you would like to share with the viewers and listeners?
Yeah, I actually do have a special announcement, for people who have, stuck with hearing my voice this far into the episode. Um, so you can follow me on Instagram, author DL Houpt. That's primarily what I've been using. My email is on there for readers or anyone who want to chat or have any questions. Um, I'm small enough that I will answer your email or your DM. I'll see it and I'll answer it. Um, but my big announcement is that I am working with Black Sheep Literary Management, and everyone should go follow them because they're wonderful. And they are just like a godsend in this whole relaunch for me. But we have decided to move up the ARC application date to this Saturday. I think it's July, let me look at the calendar. July 13th?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, Saturday, July 13th, the ARC applications for Shadow will go live, on my Instagram and on Black Sheep's Instagram as well. So there'll be a link posted there for the application forms to fill out. I'm really excited. I hope people are equally as excited and we get a good number of ARC readers. So if that's something that you as a reader or listener want to learn more about, feel free to give me a follow and be on the lookout for that. So
Awesome. I'll link all that down below in the description of this video, the social media links, as well as the link for the ARC application date. Thank you all so very much for joining us for another author interview here on the channel, my viewers and listeners, my scribes and fellow historians. And thank you to DL Houpt for coming on the show and telling us all about what to expect with the relaunch of Shadow of Polaris, as well as a little teaser into the world and what to expect. DL, thank you so very much for coming on the show, and I wish you the very best in your journey as an author.
thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. So
Awesome. Well, viewers and listeners, until next time, this has been The Wandering Scribe and The Wandering Quill, asking you to like, subscribe, and comment down below what was your favorite part of the interview. And until next time, this is The Wandering Scribe signing out, wishing you a wonderful day.